Am I okay for sound? So nodding at the back. I wish I had your projecting voice so that I could really do this without this thing. But what I'm going to do today is to...
You have the mute button.
Am I mute?
I think you're on mute.
Now it's better? Yeah?
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it makes a difference. now I'm echoing. So, to start again. What I'm going to do today is to give you a talk about a new book which I've been writing for the last 2 years. And this book is coming out next week in the UK, and in English it's called Brand Together, and it will be out in mid-April in Norway. And we've struggled a bit with the translation on this book, because a lot of the words that we want to use, talking about co-creation and communities and the idea of brand together itself, we don't find exact words in Norwegian. So between the translator and the publisher, myself, we've been arguing these things backwards and forwards. So this is the Norwegian title. I don't know what you think about it. Perhaps in a sort of Roman amphitheatre way, we could say it's up or down, or yeah. What do you think? Is it okay, or question marks?
Question mark.
Question mark?
Yeah.
Why?
Samskapt in Norwegian is a bit blurry, I think.
Is it even a word?
Well, I don't know. I'm not Norwegian, but you tell me. You can...
I'm a copywriter. So
okay.
No.
Have you ever used the word?
No.
Have you ever seen it?
No.
Oh.
I'm not able to understand it.
Okay.
No, it's a new word.
Oh, well.
Well, that could be a good thing, though.
Yeah, maybe it draws attention. It gets something.
Yeah.
Oh well. So maybe it's up from some and a sort of a wavering thumb from others. Well, that's what it's going to be anyway. But I'm going to give you a flavour of what's in this book, and the theme of it, as you may guess from the title at least, is that it's about the concept of co-creation, which is an ill-defined term in any language, as I will show. The book itself has also been co-created, as it were. So I was sort of the lead writer on this project, but you see I have co-authors. Also, I asked 5 other people to write inserts in this book. I talked to about 20 different companies all around the world and asked their views and their experiences about going through processes of co-creation. And then we had a community which lasted for 52 days. With 236 people, an online community, and these people discussed the ideas in the book and their ideas of co-creation and what co-creation could be in the future. So I had quite a lot of, if you like, active input. And then we took a draft to a forum of experts in London, about 25 people, and said to them, what do you think of this? And on the first draft, actually, they did what you did. Well. So they said to me, because I've been writing, not least with Oriel, who you're going to hear from next, quite a lot of academic papers, they said this is a bit too academic, so can you just tone it down a bit? So I had to go and do a rewrite as a result of the feedback I had. But I just want to say that the book itself reflects this idea of co-creation. And what it's doing, or what the book is trying to do at least, is to bring together 2 ideas, which unless anyone contradicts me, I think is true, that innovation and branding as ideas don't come together very much. Because when I read books by innovation experts or people talking about innovation, I never read the word brand in there. Branding doesn't come into it. It tends to be approached very much from a sort of technology on a scientific point of view. And branding books may have sort of little sections about innovation, but they don't really connect the two. So I was very specifically trying to connect these 2 ideas together. And actually the working title for the book was simply called Branding plus Innovation. It was bringing these 2 ideas together. So that's what I want to talk about today. I don't have so many slides. I'm going to talk to you about the theory of the idea. I'm going to give you some examples, mostly from the book research. And then I'm going to talk about the practicalities, because it might just be the case that you suddenly have the urge tomorrow to go out and co-create, as it were. So there are some tips in here at the same time. What I want to say is this is hardly a new idea. So if we go back some sort of 300 years, and we go back to London in 1730, what we find is a huge number of coffee shops. And of course you have some very nice coffee shops now in Trondheim as well. But in 1730, and London at the time had a population of 700,000, there were 550 coffee shops. And these coffee shops are interesting. What people used to do before they started drinking coffee, because you couldn't drink the water in London, that would kill you, you would drink beer. You would drink beer in the morning, you drink beer at lunchtime, and you'd probably have a gin or two and perhaps a beer in the evening. The school I went to in London, in fact, we used to have beer cellars down in the basement. Because, not in my time, but in previous generations, the school children used to drink beer. Of course, you didn't want to kill them with making them drink water. This was perhaps quite nice for people, but and they got together in pubs and had conversations. But of course, if you're drinking beer all day, you probably don't quite remember what you talked about. So there was a challenge here, if you like, as these places as places of socialization. But what happens with coffee is rather than being drunk all day, you're actually suddenly stimulated. So these coffee houses are the source, if you like, the generator of the Enlightenment, which in Norwegian is opplysningstiden.
Yeah, that's right.
That's my one Norwegian word for the day, I think. I don't want to push my luck. So you had people coming together from very diverse backgrounds, engineers, scientists, writers, artists, and they were getting together and meeting in these coffee shops. And because they were bringing this great cognitive diversity together, all these different perspectives, and they were sitting down in these very social arenas, they were creating the ideas that really formed the Enlightenment. So coffee shops are very valuable to us, and they're an example, if you like, of early co-creation, of people coming together with diverse experiences and creating something new from that diversity. Which makes it sort of interesting when we go forward a few hundred years to Starbucks. But Starbucks are trying to sort of replicate this experience. Personally, I'm not very keen on the Starbucks coffee. And I think it's a godsend that we only have, as far as I know, one in Norway, which is in the airport at Gardermoen. So the longer it stays away, the better in my view. But as a branding example, I think we can talk about it. So what Starbucks have been doing, of course, they went through a phase in the 2000s when it was really, I think, struggling as a brand. And it's tried to rejuvenate itself. And one of the mechanisms it's used to do that is this idea of co-creation. So my Starbucks idea, you can go onto the website and you can suggest new things. You can suggest new ways of doing things with the environments, new products, new product extensions, changing the whole experience. If that was just a suggestion scheme, it wouldn't be really co-creation. But actually what Starbucks do is they allocate groups of people, I can't remember the name of them, sort of ambassadors from Starbucks, who are there to nurture and make sure the ideas are discussed and developed. And then people vote on them. And then they're implemented. The best ones are taken forward into a final implementation. So there is this if you like, although it's now online, we don't actually do this face-to-face so often in coffee shops. There is this sense, I think, within Starbucks of this attempt to co-create and to be original and to generate new things. Now, you might say that generating a new flavor of coffee is hardly the same as the ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. So we are in a sort of different league. But I would say there is a famous Enlightenment figure called Priestley, and one of the things he was most famous for in his lifetime was inventing soda water. So we might see there's a parallel between the past and the present there too. So I want to suggest really then that co-creation is about three things. And I'm trying to we're in a stage of this whole talking about co-creation, at least in its modern context. It really, although there are antecedents, in particular in Scandinavia, which was a pioneer of cooperative design, which was a sort of co-creative process. But in its modern sort of incarnation, it dates back to 2004, when two writers, Prahalad and Ramaswamy, they wrote a book and they said we should stop seeing consumers as these passive beings and see them as active participants in the formulation of brands. So it's this idea of being active, I think, is very important. But there are these three principles coming through, and the idea of co-creation is still at the stage of it's sort of still a bit loose, still being defined by people and still being discussed a lot. And indeed, one of the things I'm working on with Oriel, who you hear from Lex, as I say, is we're trying to pin this down and work out exactly what co-creation is. But it has three particular facets. So it is about creativity. A lot of what goes on in terms of market research, for example, if I think of all the sort of market research groups I've been involved with over the years, you go into market research groups, probably within the organization you've developed 2, 3, 4 ideas, and you show them to people and you ask them to discuss it a bit, and then you ask them to choose one. So it lacks, if you like, a creativity element. So what I'm arguing here is we go beyond this mere choosing process that goes on sometimes in market research processes to actually argue that people should be creatively involved in developing new ideas and new products and services. We would also say it is collaborative in the sense there has to be a dialogue between the organization and the people taking part. I'm going to talk a lot about consumers, but certainly in the book there's also examples coming from other audiences. So it's collaborating with other parties. And finally, there is, I think, somewhere in this process, a sense of the organization. And this is where this gets sort of slightly difficult, because there are brand communities out there that are formed by interested people, which exist and naturally occurring communities. They exist beyond the boundaries of the organization. But when I'm talking about co-creation here, I'm really talking about co-creation that involves the organization in some way. And that's where, when we get to the practical bits, we have to be most careful, because there's a real danger that organizations, when they get involved in co-creation processes, they want to control it. And what I'm going to try and argue is somehow you have to let go of it. You have to recognize that the space of co-creation is something where the individual and the organization come together to create something new. But we'll sort of reinforce that. I also want to just separate the idea of co-creation from things it's not. Because I've read a lot in the last few years about this subject, and you read articles which say this is co-creation, and I think, well, it's not exactly. So you have examples out there like this shirt company here, like Nike Ind, where you can go into a website and you can choose patterns and colors and fabrics, and you can tailor the product to your own requirements. I think in essence that's no different from what went on before we had mass markets. It's about tailoring and individualizing products. So I think mass customization, whilst it's interesting in itself, is not co-creation. Secondly, you have examples out there of open innovation, and this has been written about a lot, and it certainly does overlap with co-creation. This is from an American website called Quirky, which is quite interesting. People put their product ideas up onto Quirky, they get input from others, and they can sell their products through this Quirky site. So it has some elements of co-creation, but there isn't really an involvement, if you like, of the organization directly in the process of development. So I'd say, again, whilst open innovation is interesting, and certainly Procter & Gamble have been very keen and enthusiastic promoters of the idea of open innovation, as one example, moving from this sort of closed model of the past where you try and keep things in-house. It isn't quite co-creation again. And it's not mass collaboration. It's a good job. Jan's not here perhaps to disagree with me. But in YouTube, you might co-create a film in itself, but once you put it up there, all you've done is offer it to people, and then other people can comment. So there isn't, I don't think, co-creation there either. And nor is there when we think about crowdsourcing, which is about asking people to either generate lots of ideas or vote on ideas. Again, all of these things are interesting and valuable and can be used in the right context, but I would say they're not co-creation. So sort of to give you a sort of summarized definition of where I think this is. I think co-creation should emphasize this active element of consumers. We see that we live in participatory times, that people do want to tweet, they do want to engage with other communities on Facebook, we do want to form brand communities. There are we want to post things on Wikipedia and on YouTube. So there is this sort of groundswell, I think, of consumers becoming ever more active. So I think co-creation should recognize that activism of consumers and other audiences. And I would also stress it's about a creative process. There is a view, which is put forward in various books, that creativity is the preserve of an elite. And of course, if some of you work in advertising agencies, I spent 8 years working in advertising agencies, there was that department who were called creatives, who dressed differently, talked differently, and was somehow superior, as I'm sure you can feel that if you are one, to us lesser beings. In Britain, you're always called suits. I don't know what you're called here if you're account manager, but we were called suits and they were called creatives. And we were looked down on, of course, by the creatives because we weren't creative people at all. So there is a sense that I think that creativity has this elevated status. But I think what we learned from, especially from doing this community we created for this book, was that actually if you create the right context, everyone can be creative. So I think creativity is something that's within us. I think it's actually pushed, this is a whole separate debate I like having over dinner tables, but I think it's pushed out of us in school, that we're all right to be creative up until we're about 9 or 10, and then we're required to conform and be less creative. But I think if you create the right environment, we can tap into this creativity that I think people do possess universally. So the creative, active, the social element is also important, because the reason we work with communities and take part in these things is creating a sense of meaning for ourselves, and also looking for the plaudits, the appraise of others. So I think it's inherently a social process. And as I say, it involves the organisation. I want to make that point, but we ought to be very careful about the organisation trying to control what goes on. So that's the essence of it. It's still open for debate and discussion, but I think it sort of gets us to a point where you can see where this idea is heading. So why might it be valuable? There's a really nice book by someone called Steve Johnson called Where Good Ideas Come From. And in this book, he makes the point that when you put people together in a community, it's not that the crowd itself becomes wise, but rather connected individuals become smarter. So what this is sort of this cognitive diversity point again. If you create a safe space for people, and you can sometimes see this happening when you do workshops with people you feel comfortable with, and people can come from very diverse backgrounds. So you can have someone who comes from a medical background, someone who comes from a science, someone who's an artist. You put these people together, and because once they learn the different languages of each other, you can begin to create these very interesting connections. So the argument in his book, and he gives really interesting examples, it's this connectivity that makes us more intelligent, as it were, as individuals. Why organizations are interested in co-creation? The great quest for organizations is to try and get close to customers. Of course, if you have a small business, if you have a shop, probably you meet most of your customers and your would-be customers every day, and you talk to them and you learn from them. But as soon as you have any sort of scale, you begin to encounter this problem of how do we know what our customers really want and what do they think? And of course, the success, if you will, of marketing and branding thinking over the last 50 years has been to use market research to access the ideas and the behavior of customers. But I would always say we should remind ourselves that when we're looking at a focus group, when we're looking at market research information, it is an abstraction. We are looking at abstract data, and we're drawing conclusions from it. And it's been quite interesting. Some of the examples I'm going to tell you about are organizations that do lots of market research, have reports telling them exactly what their customers think and do, but actually they're really then very surprised when they meet customers and customers tell them things. You think this is strange. They've been reading about this for years. How do they never take notice of this? But I think we often because when we read things on paper, we don't get the same force as when someone tells us something. And also, I think it's too easy to filter these things out. We have other things to pay attention to, and therefore we don't notice perhaps some of these more subtle things. But maybe that will come through better as I talk about the examples. Has the potential, I think, to heighten creativity, and it also reduces risk, because actually what you're doing, if you take a community of 400 people and you stick them together for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, actually they're going to tell you everything you want to know, not only about how to develop and enhance the products you have, but also how to market them. So again, from the research I was doing, some really interesting examples of organizations that were struggling with specific segments, couldn't work out how to reach them in the right sort of way. But then they use these sort of methods where they had direct input from the audience, and then they begin to see solutions. So it's about opening up our eyes to the possibilities, I think, and reducing risk through the process. Also, I think it has the power to energize the organization. That has a danger to it as well, because you put a bunch of executives in with 50 consumers, and they talk to each other, and the executives walk out and say, now we know the answer. So there has to be, if you like, this what it does, I think, connecting executives with consumers does generate the opportunity for change. It persuades people of the need for change. And there's also some interesting examples about that have been written about that in the past. But it also, if you immediately act without reflection, you can potentially take wrong turnings. So this also, co-creation as a process, has to be treated with caution. So Oriel and I sat down one day about 3 years ago, and we drew this chart. Probably from an academic point of view, it's not complicated enough. Not enough boxes and arrows. But what I always used to do, when I used to try and explain the interactions between an organization and its customers, I would draw a box or a circle on one side, and then I would draw arrows, and maybe there's other boxes in the way, and eventually something would get to the consumer. As if the consumer was living on Mars and had never heard of my products or the category or anything about consuming, which is, on reflection, rather a strange idea. So this is sort of a slight revelation in a way, to say the point I would make about this chart is the organization and the individual here are already connected. And this simply makes the point that if you go out and launch a new restaurant, for example, tomorrow, and then I hear about it, I don't hear about it with no conception of what a restaurant is. I've already experienced maybe 3 or 4 restaurants in Trondheim. I know what restaurants do. I know what sort of food I like. I have experience. So in some sense, I'm already connected. We don't have this sort of distance between the subject and object that exists in these charts with boxes and arrows going across. So that connectivity is already there. Also, I would say that sort of an important point is I've used the word, or we've used the word, individual here, which in itself is not ideal, but we wanted to say that the act of consumption wasn't an important aspect in terms of having an opinion. Because I can have strong opinions about cars, for example, as we had an example earlier from Volkswagen, about a Volkswagen car, and I can either be very positive or very negative, and I might never have owned one or intend to buy one. But I can go out and tell other individuals exactly what I think about Volkswagen. So the act of consumption isn't always important. So I want to stress it's not the consumer, it is the individual who may be a consumer. And if I press the right button here, this is the space, I would argue, where if you like, the brand is co-created, as the individual and the organization comes together. And that is a fluid space, which is always moving and changing as discussions and dialogues go on. We can say, in fact, that this is also, sort of like communities of co-creation exist in this space. Am I making sense? Not too simple, is it? Okay. So some examples, because otherwise it all sounds a bit sort of too theoretical. So I wanted to try and bring this to life with some instances. And actually, maybe this isn't such a good choice, because I realized once I'd put this slide up there, I'm not allowed to say too much about it, because it's sort of slightly secret as a project. But I think it's quite an interesting project. A lot of the focus...
You kill us if you say something.
Yeah, that's true. What was I going to say? No, it's okay. What I was going to say about this, Etihad. It's a Middle Eastern airline, and now I remember what I was going to say. A lot of the focus on co-creation is talking about online communities. What I want to stress here is they don't have to be online. You can go out and create small communities online quite easily, probably, and engage in discussions with people. But what in the case of Etihad would you do? What they're doing here is they're trying to design the interior of the Airbus A380. So this is a 550-seater double-decker plane. What should the interior look like in terms of the economy class, first class, business class? And you could have a discussion about that online. But actually, what you want to say, a lot of it, as you can see actually in these images, is about what you do in space. So then it makes sense to make these processes actually physical. So what was done in the case of Etihad, they had 250 consumers in 4 different locations, and they worked together for 2 days. So these aren't sort of little 1-hour sessions like focus groups. These are 2-day sessions. In addition to the 250 consumers, you have 40 executives from the company. So they are directly working with consumers. And also you have the industrial and product designers working in the process too. So when they're working in teams and doing things together, these are mixtures of managers, designers, and consumers working together on ideas. So again, it's about trying to make this cognitive diversity work for you. And what they can do in a physical space, and when you have time, is actually build what you would like your space on the plane to be. So in a bit of a Middle Eastern style, I might say, we have this chap here who's created his own very personal space. The practicality of maybe is something else. But the people who are talking about these ideas, they're talking about every aspect, if you like, of the customer journey. They're saying how we want to be treated when we come onto the plane, the sort of entertainment we want preloaded, the way we want people to interact with us, how we manage the duality of privacy with socialization, especially if you're on long-haul flights. Sometimes you want to be private and you want to sleep. Other times you want to sit in a bar and chat to people. How do you manage these 2 processes? And importantly, it came through quite strongly from the comments of people. What they were saying is that business class and first class have changed a lot in the last 20, 25 years. But they said economy is still the same sort of thing it always was. So they paid a lot of attention here actually to looking at economy seats, thinking about space, how you could make the experience better. So this will launch next year. And as I say, it was a bit of a secret project, so I wasn't allowed to talk too much about it, but I can talk about the generality of it. So if we take a second example, hotels. So this is a hotel chain in, again, it's a Middle Eastern example actually, called Jumeirah. How much time have I got?
1 hour.
Oh, that's a long time, isn't it? I suddenly thought I've got to finish at 4 o'clock. So no, I can slow down now. So Jumeirah, a Middle Eastern hotel group, they own this I think it's a 7-star hotel, which looks like a sail. Have you ever seen this? I went to this hotel with someone who works at Telenor once, and he said, we've got one of these in Malta. So apparently they're, I'm not sure quite it's 7-star, but it is the same shape. So I thought what's interesting about this case is the people who ran Jumeirah approached the whole process with a very open mind. Again, these were physical events, 2-day events with people. And what was interesting, I interviewed a couple of people from the hotel chain, the chief executive and the marketing director. And they said what's interesting is, we're in the hotel business. We see customers all the time. Our staff are talking to customers. We have customer surveys. You'd think we would know everything our customers want. So actually, it's been quite surprising going through this process that we don't seem to know what our customers want at all. And he said there's a big difference from reading a statement on a customer questionnaire that they filled in the room saying, I find it irritating that I have to pay for broadband access in this hotel. And someone standing shouting at you in the middle of a crowded room saying they're absolutely disgusted with the hotel management for doing this sort of thing. He said that's actually much more persuasive. So they went through a process here of identifying the problems, trying to identify the bottlenecks in the experience, because they wanted to create a brand that offered this sense of superiority. It was going to be better than other hotel experiences in the Middle East. They've now extended into New York and London and other places. How to do this? And part of the thing was about dealing with all the detail of the stay. So they went with people and they talked through all their problems. And then they went through these problems again and said, now how do we solve them together? So it's this sense of creatively working together to find out what the answers were. And just to give you a couple of examples from this process. One is one of the things that people found very irritating was check-in. So you arrive in Dubai after a long flight. You sit in long traffic jams these days trying to get from the airport. You get to your hotel and then you stand in a queue. So people were irritated about this and said, why can't you just change this queue system? So then they sat down and worked out ways to do this so that you would have mobile portable machines that staff could carry around and check in people as they sat in the bar or having a drink or chatting to each other, or they could do it in the room. So they worked out that people could have a choice of 6 different ways of checking in. So they didn't have to stand in the queue at the counter. So it's simple sort of ideas, but it takes away an irritation. Another example that came from a sort of families group was to say you go away on a nice week or 2-week holiday, and then as you pack your bags, you have this vision not only of the flight home, but then having to unpack when you get home and washing everything and doing the laundry and all the sort of tedious bits. So they said, why don't we create a sort of wash and go sort of offer? What you can do, what the hotel can do, is offer a low price wash service, and they will then wash all your clothes on the day that you depart, iron them and pack them for you. So this is the idea of taking away again the stress points. So this is what they're looking for, all the problem areas that people found irritating, and then changing these to enhance the overall experience. Do you feel the same?
No, it's fantastic, because one of the most irritating points at a hotel is that it costs $1 million to wash anything.
Yeah. Well, that's, the point he was making is that it costs a lot to wash clothes in hotels. And actually, they do this. They do the same, because they make their margins out of all these little things like broadband access. And they were worried about that particular point. So customers are saying, wouldn't it be great if? But then they were saying, but maybe there's going to be a big price difference between what we normally do charge people for washing and ironing a shirt, and then this cut pricing. So, but that's what they decided to do. They would give it a go and see what happened. So it's a willingness to trial things. And I think in service industries, you can trial these things. Yeah. Yeah, it is too expensive in hotels, isn't it? Turning now to online communities. Sometimes these communities are time constrained. So there's one here for Activia. It's a Danone brand. And the community here was with something like 500 women, because it's a female targeted brand, and the community existed for 2 months, trying to solve some specific issues. But companies like Virgin Media in particular, have permanent communities. So they refresh these communities all the time, but they have people there discussing all the time new ideas and attitudes to what's going on, reviewing advertising for competitors, all sorts of things. So you can have, if you like, a continual process of contact. Of course, that requires a lot of commitment then from the organisation. Or you can use it for specific tasks. In the case of Activia, what they wanted to, well, I was going to talk a bit about this, about sort of extending and developing brands. But what they wanted to do was think, where can we take this brand in the future? And what came out of online discussions was the generation of 10 new workable ideas, 2 of which they launched, which were both successful. One of them is there, which is a pouring yogurt. What intrigued me actually specifically about this Activia community was how revealing people were willing to be about themselves. Some of the quotes from people I thought was really surprising. Because they would say things, I've never told my husband or my children about this, but, and then they would tell 500 strangers about it. But I think it was part of the function of, I think this is important in communities, of allowing people to build trust with each other. So you have to take time at the front of the process. It has the advantage of speed once you get it going. People can give you very quick reactions on things, but you have to take the time to be soft at the outset, to let people discuss what they need to discuss with each other. And then they can be amazingly revealing of themselves in quite a surprising way. So it's very, I think it's very powerful. And look at the brand the community we created specifically for the book in a minute. The other picture there, is Sony Music. They also have an ongoing online community, which is about talking about what bands and acts should be doing and how they should be positioned. Sort of actually quite marketing-led talk. And again, I was sort of quite surprised how motivated people were. If you looked at the language that is used on these communities, that's sort of the surprising thing. Just how engaged and enthusiastic people are about the communities they take part in. The final example, which I didn't include in the book, although I did read about it, I think is very interesting. This is a co-created museum. It's called the Wing Luke, and it's the Asian Museum in Seattle. And they have a philosophy that everything we do as a museum should be co-created. So this isn't just about the museum deciding, well, we're going to have an exhibition about a certain aspect of Asian life on the west coast of America and saying to people, what are your ideas? They just say to people, what are your ideas? Give us your proposals. So they get people to generate the ideas, and then the organization, as it were, meets them. They train people who are interested in taking part in aspects of the museum, and they train their staff in community building. They also employ people not only on technical knowledge, but their ability to be good at social interaction. So it's interesting because they built the whole idea of co-creation into the whole way of thinking about everything they do in this museum. And I think what that does, there's a nice chapter in a book called, if you key in Wing Luke and co-created museum into Google, a little ad for them there, you'll see the sort of short chapter on them. The chapter is very interesting about how they've adopted it completely as a philosophy and the sort of benefits it gives them in terms of making the museum relevant to its immediate audience. And you see examples of this sometimes in other organizations, but I haven't seen another cultural institution do this so wholeheartedly. Actually, most of my experience with cultural institutions is they don't like their customers. Does anyone work for a cultural institution? Hi. Just to say, I worked once for the Royal Opera House in London, and they really hated their customers. They were just a damn nuisance. So there is sometimes this cynicism. So let's get slightly practical and look about how we might make this work. If I can drink without putting the microphone in the water. Okay. So where do you start if you're going to do this? Well, you've got to know why you're doing it. So you can do this in formal and informal ways. You can make big commitments to it, or you can just experiment with a particular service. So if you work in a bank, for example, one of the organizations I talked through in this process was Barclays. They weren't really convinced. They're quite conservative about the whole idea of co-creation. But they said, let's try it out on our student account and see if it works there. And then once they tried it on the student account, then they extended it. But the point is, I think, to know why you're doing it. What you're really trying to learn. Are you trying to understand how to market a product, or do you want to generate a new range of products? Is it sort of revolutionary innovation, or is it just evolving something? So you have to understand where you're starting from, and that will help you define the purpose. And also then that leads in itself into the process. The important thing, I think, in the process is communities, online communities versus physical events do different things. So I would always say if you're dealing with issues of space and you want a lot of interaction, then live communities when people can be face to face is ideal. So if you're doing an airline, if you're doing a hotel, if you're doing a retail shop, do that face-to-face because you can have these interactions, you can make things, you can build things. It becomes much more productive, I think. Or if you want something which is about difficult to talk about that might be a bit sort of intimate, then online communities are better because they deliver a degree of anonymity to people. And of course, in some cases, you want to mix these two elements in different ways to achieve different outputs. So they're not mutually exclusive, but they do have slightly different roles in the process. I said just now about this taking time to establish trust. I think this is one of the most important things in the whole way of treating communities and events. One of the things we did on the Brand Together community was I had someone in London, a German girl, who took the sort of lead on being the facilitator for the community. And she put up her photograph wearing a dirndl, if you know what a dirndl is. It's what Bavarian girls wear at beer fest. You know these sort of outfits? Yeah, so I thought it was quite fun. And actually it generated a whole host of posts about what she was wearing. And it gave her a great opportunity to discuss about where her outfit came from and the heritage of it and why she wore it, and people commented on it backwards and forwards. And it took us away from the immediate purpose, but again, this process of making the whole thing feel easy and light and sort of comfortable. Also on the Brand Together community, one we did specifically for the book, but generally I think it's a good principle. We had, I think, about 20 things we wanted people to do. So we set out with 20 tasks and we explained to people we have these things. But we said this is your community as much as ours. You do what you want on it as well. So in addition to our 20 tasks, there were 120 separate strands that people developed, talking about branding, talking about infidelity. That was, I thought, quite interesting. Talking about any theme that came to mind for them. And then they would gather like-minded people around on this community to discuss these ideas. You may say, well, that's all sort of getting off the point, but it is all about creating something that's social and trusting where people can really get across ideas. I would always say to organizations, absolutely you should share as much as your time. If you ask people to come along to a focus group, well, that's just like a chat in a bar, isn't it? You go along for an hour and you give your opinions, you go away again. But if you ask people to be on a community for 3-4 months, that's almost, I wasn't going to say like a marriage, but that's overstating the case probably, but it's a much longer relationship and people invest much more in it. And if they invest much more in it, they want more out of it. So they expect the organization to be willing to share and not say, oh, we can't tell you that, we don't trust you. The organisation has to give as much as it can, and it has to give as much feedback as it can in the process as well. So there are some key, I think, do's and don'ts, which look maybe obvious when I write them down here, but if you don't do them, you undermine the creativity of the community. And I think this key thing is at the end, I said, don't instrumentalize. Of course, when you're an organisation, you say, we want to do this, we've set out an objective, we want to do this because we want to find a new product that fits this particular market segment. But there's a danger when you do that, you get too focused on just solving that problem. And as I say, people want to use the space for other things. You should allow that. You should allow this space to become comfortable. And to remember, which organizations, again, easily forget, that once people have made this investment, they want to know what's happened with their ideas. So you can't just walk away and say, thank you very much, we'll go and do what we were going to do anyway. You have to give people proper feedback. So there are challenges there. It definitely requires commitment. I'm not going to talk through these in detail. It's just to say you can pick and choose different techniques at different stages. And you can use co-creation throughout a whole process, or you can just use it at a point in time. So just to draw attention to something. Oops, wrong button. Now I'm lost, aren't I? There we go. That one. So art from within is just sort of an exercise to explore new ideas. It's where you get people to draw out ideas very quickly, very promptly. You can do mood boards and other things you would experience also, perhaps in more traditional forms of market research. What else do we have here? Dragon's Den is quite interesting. What's the name of this program in Norwegian? It's where entrepreneurs present ideas to a team of people. Skapen. No, that's my second word in Norwegian. Skapen. So this is using the same concept. So Orange Telecom use this process. In fact, they use two things. They asked people to be ethnographers for them. So they took a bunch of consumers and they said, go out for 2 weeks and on your mobile phones, take photographs of your friends and your family and record what they're doing. Observe. They trained them to be ethnographers and they said, go out and do this. And then they brought them back in and they shared their ethnography with consumers and also with managers. And out of that, they began to build ideas. And once they built ideas in these mixed teams, then they pitched them to this sort of Scarpelin type format, their ideas to a Dragon's Den committee, and the committee then would say yes, yes, no, no. So there's a whole process built out, taking things from popular culture, taking things from other sources, making this not too rational, but a bit playful as well. So I think that's also key. So I want to just share finally some sort of key facts and thoughts. Again, the assumption of managers in organizations is that people will only be interested in doing these co-creation exercises if you pay them well. Their assumption is that they're motivated by extrinsics, by money and rewards. But actually what came through when we asked the question in this community, why do you find this interesting? Actually the dominant factor is it's a process of meaning making for people. And again, well, we've got figures here that say this, but if I shared with you sort of the tone of voice of people talking on the community, you really get a sense of how people find a sense of meaning here. They give great richness and depth to their thought, and sometimes they're not writing just sort of little one-liners, sometimes they're writing things like this. So these 236 people generated more than 14,000 entries, and they spent nearly 2,000 hours online. And actually what they're getting out of it is some vouchers that they can spend on Amazon if they give good contributions. If they don't make good contributions, they don't get anything.
How do you measure that? How do you measure that?
By terms of the number of times they're making inputs. So if you have a passive person, they don't get the rewards. But the clear thing is the rewards are sort of help give them a rationale for why they're doing it. But their main motivation is because they are interested in brands and the discussions, and they want to contribute to them, and they want to share their ideas, which again places an obligation on the organisation to give response on those ideas. So the meaning making, the brand engagement bit is very important. But also there's clearly a sort of socialisation aspect. What people like is talking to each other and sharing thoughts and ideas on what they might do. So we can take this into account. It means we can not pay people very much to do this, which you might say, yes.
But do they get credit?
Do they get credit?
Yeah.
In what way?
As for being participant or co-creators?
Well,
I think it's a big difference between getting paid or getting credit.
yes. Well, if you ask the individuals, what they very much want, and maybe it's a bit on the next slide, is they want the organisation to be really listening to them, to take their ideas into account and to give them feedback. But there's a bit of a gap here because organisations don't do that as well as they should. And you can see that in these communities, but I can also see it sometimes in organisations who aren't doing it sort of co-creation this sort of way. I looked at a magazine, a women's magazine called More, who are doing this primarily through Facebook. And what they've done is that all their editorial staff are responsible for talking back to customers. And that makes it work. But I looked at other organisations and people are giving comments and suggestions and thoughts, and the organisation has never allocated the resources to create the dialogue. And then people get disappointed and fed up. So I think it creates a real obligation for the organisation, and it has to put resources in place to manage that. Yeah. So you can see just here some of these sort of some of these comments from people. That people talk about being active, they're talking about responding to each other's opinions. Actually, what they were doing here, they were asked a series of questions. They were asked to compare their experiences of online communities versus focus groups versus other forms of research. And I haven't put all the slides up here, but online community is definitely the most engaging and rewarding for people. So it scores very much highly on these sort of spidergram charts. But it's, I think it's this very strong sense of connectivity with the community because they feel the community is at least in part theirs. And there are some experiments. When we think about the future of co-creation, that is maybe quite interesting because there have been some experiments now where organizations are beginning to share their intellectual property. Because, well, I have a quote in a minute, you'll see. Some people feel, I'm giving a lot to this, and what am I getting back out of it? And I think maybe co-creation will change. At the moment, people want to do it because they think it's interesting and engaging and rewarding. But maybe in the future, they will want to have a bigger slice of the pie and say, I contributed to that idea, therefore I want a slice of that intellectual property. So we have to see how this develops. But there are companies that have started to do that. And what co-creation makes people feel is they improve their perceptions of the brand. These are the people taking part in brand communities. And also, very significantly, it makes them feel close to the brand. So whatever you get out of this sort of community, what you have is 400 or 500, if you like, enthusiasts for your community who give you good word of mouth sort of plaudits for what you do. So there are interesting things going on there. I've only just sort of given you a flavour of this. People also feel quite strongly that they become much more creative. So you see a big shift in that measure too. So it's a self-reporting, so we might not judge that it really is necessarily true, but it's quite hard to know whether it is genuinely more creative. But at least in themselves, they feel their sense of creativity heightened. So, last couple of slides. So there is, I think, a tremendous opportunity here. There's a quote here from someone at Orange. I think this isn't untypical. There's this point of we think we know how our consumers think, and then we're surprised when we talk to them that they think slightly differently. So we get insulated in our corporate walls, and we forget inside the organisation what's really going on outside. So this interaction direct with people, I think, can be very powerful. I think the whole area of co-creation, it has better applicability in certain areas than others. I did talk to, for example, BMW about this, but I spoke to the people in California who are working on in-car entertainment and in-car experiences. And they said, you know, you can do these sort of co-creative processes here, but could you co-create a new car? Well, there is an example of that has been done, actually, but within BMW, he said the sort of length of time involved in generating a new car and the engineering excellence actually makes this quite hard to do. But I think you can still generate consumer input in all sorts of different ways. And there are good examples. There's a book called Democratizing Innovation, which talks in quite technical areas about how people can contribute to creativity in all sorts of different contexts. So I don't think we should exclude any area. Once you have, especially when we think about communities, once you have your community established, and you've built trust and you've built this sense of socialization, then actually it gives you really fast feedback to issues. So your competitor puts out a TV ad tonight and you sit at home and you think, well, what's that going to do? Well, actually, if you have a community, you can ask them and know the answer tomorrow. So that speed of response can be very valuable to you. It does bring, I think, organizations generally much closer to customers. And it's a great galvanizer, a helper of organizational change because it brings that customer face to face with you. And especially when you do these sort of events and you get people working together, you can see how it really changes managers' ways of thinking. I mentioned the problems. Well, this is a comment from someone on the community, which is sort of instructive in itself. Here they say, I like your style. I wish I'd thought of your idea. It's a great money-spinning concept. Because you can pay 300 people a few quid for coming up with ideas, developing them and showing which ones they like. Company gets good ideas cheaply. They can implement without as much costly R&D. You get to write a book on it, and we get a few quid and a sense of, yay, I helped think of that when the ideas are acted on. Genius. So, when I say people are very positive towards this, some aren't. Yeah, some are cynical about it. We ask consumers to work for free, and in some sense this is a sort of manipulative process. And certainly there are social theorists out there who say this whole idea of co-creation is a very bad thing. And we can take that view and have, I think, some sympathy with it as well. But I think we can also see that people do genuinely get something out of it as well in terms of this sense, as I say, of socialization and meaning making. And I think the reward side will begin to probably change in some way, but I'm not quite sure how that will work. So that brings us back to coffee and to congratulate Trondheim on having such good coffee shops and to say you should keep Starbucks out for as long as possible. Okay, thank you.
Any questions? Are there any questions for?
Yes.
Maybe you mentioned it, but when you're going to recruit people into your community, you need a certain level of quality of your community members. How do you?
Well, I was going to say, what do you mean by quality?
You need them. They have to have a certain competence, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's. I think well, I mean, it depends who you ask about this question. A lot of people, I think, who are working in this area would say what you want to try and recruit are people who are very creative. So actually, lots of people working there will go out and look for creative individuals to populate these communities. I think we came to the conclusion here, that, as I say, that if you create the right atmosphere, everyone has the potential to be creative. So my co-authors run a co-creation consultancy which has offices in London and New York with about 50 people in. And they say we've come to the conclusion that everyone can be creative. So I think we have to be careful there when we talk about quality. I think it's more about matching people in terms of the profile you want to use and to getting people who are enthusiastic. You will always get some people who are cynical, and you will always get some people who don't take part. But you want to make sure that you get a core of people who are willing to be active. So it raises an interesting question. You need to have a purpose which is motivating for people. So if you give them a very dull thing to do, they won't get very energized. If you give them something they think is exciting and has potential and can have an impact on the world, they're much more likely to be engaged with the process. And also then you have to recruit people to needs. So there's an interesting example I came across, which is the UK Tax Authority. And what they wanted to do was to work out better ways of improving tax evasion. So then they had to find people who were tax evaders. So they're quite hard to find. You have to search quite hard to people. But they said the surprising thing was